What would you do if the person you trusted most lied to you for an entire year? In today's story, a husband discovers the shocking truth about his wife's betrayal and decides to fight back in a way that no one expected. This is not just about cheating. It's about lies, revenge, and the price of broken promises. Stay with me because the twists in this story will leave you speechless. And if you're new here, welcome to Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss these powerful stories. Now, let's step into today's drama. She cheated for a year, my revenge exposed every lie. From the outside, Daniel and Melissa Carter's home looked like the kind of house people slowed down to admire. A white fence, a garden trimmed just enough to suggest care, a wobbly basketball hoop leaning tiredly over the driveway, and their 8-year-old son's scooter always tipped on its side near the porch. To the neighborhood, they were stability. To friends, they were enviable. To Daniel, at least until recently, they were safe. The daily rituals still happened. Daniel grinding coffee before sunrise, Melissa setting the lunchbox beside their son's backpack. Lights clicked off before bed. But the atmosphere had shifted. What once felt like warmth now felt like air conditioning turned 1 degree too low. The gestures were still there, but they had turned functional. A kiss on the forehead rather than the lips. A text message listing errands instead of a late-night conversation that once lasted hours. Daniel was the kind of man who repaired things before replacing them. He took on extra projects at work to prove his usefulness, tried cooking new recipes on weeknights, left notes in Melissa's car that said "love you" with a small smiley face. She thanked him each time without lifting her eyes from her phone. Mark Evans, his closest friend, liked to joke that marriage was seasonal. Spring carried passion, summer brought ease, autumn carried fatigue, and winter was silence. But even Mark noticed that Melissa's smiles looked rehearsed, her lips shaping the curve while her eyes wandered elsewhere. The first oddity didn't arrive as drama, but as an inconvenience, an automated email about an iCloud password reset for their shared family account. Neither Daniel nor Melissa admitted requesting it. Daniel deleted it as spam, too busy to consider what it might mean. The second oddity arrived wrapped in silence. On their wedding anniversary, Daniel sent 3 texts across the evening, no reply. Melissa slipped in at 4 in the morning, mumbling about a work deadline. She didn't smell of perfume or alcohol, only exhaustion, but the distance between them widened like a hairline crack in glass. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He realized guessing was a fool's strategy. He was not a man who thrived on suspicion. He was a man who organized. So he pulled a fresh notebook from his desk, wrote home notes on the cover, and began recording. Dates, times, explanations, small inconsistencies. If love was slipping through his hands, then at least he would hold onto the facts. The notebook that Daniel had started, just to steady his own doubts, slowly turned into something heavier. What began as a whisper of uncertainty became a ledger, a private insurance policy against his own imagination. At first, he told himself it was only for balance, a way to calm restless thoughts. But as the weeks stretched into months, the pages filled faster than he expected. Patterns began to surface where once there had only been excuses. Melissa's phone, which used to lie charging face up on the nightstand, now always slept face down as if it needed privacy of its own. Notifications no longer chimed in the open air. Instead, they pulsed silently, lighting up for no one but her. Trips to the bathroom stretched long enough to type, long enough for her to reappear with that vague exhaustion she carried like a shield. When Daniel asked gentle questions, she offered bureaucratic replies. "I'm exhausted, maybe tomorrow," but tomorrow always slipped away before it arrived. The absence of intimacy didn't fade slowly, it collapsed all at once. A marriage that had once carried rhythm now felt like an office arrangement. She brushed his cheek the way a stranger signs a receipt, polite, quick, detached. Daniel tried not to accuse. He was a fixer, not a destroyer. Mark, his oldest friend, reminded him of that, his advice more engineer than poet. Measure, don't confront. Keep records. If it's nothing, you'll calm down. If it's something, then you'll know. So Daniel became a collector of traces. His notebook grew methodical, almost clinical. Dates, claimed schedules, mileage on Melissa's car, receipts tucked into trash bins, a new perfume he had never bought, a playlist on her phone that sounded curated for someone else's taste. 6 months in, the pages no longer looked like paranoia, they looked like a map. A triangle began to emerge in his notes. A downtown theater with late-night showings. A dental clinic with far too many emergency appointments. A garage 2 blocks away, sitting quietly between the other 2. Each time Melissa claimed she had a dentist appointment, a blockbuster film happened to sell out at that same hour. Each time she said she was handling inventory at the office, a charge from the garage processed on their shared credit card. It could still have been coincidence. But coincidence begins to look like choreography when the dates align too cleanly. The pages, once scribbled with hesitation, now looked like invisible ink revealed under the light of heartbreak. Their next wedding anniversary confirmed what the ledger had been whispering. Melissa handed him a gift card with a quick kiss on the forehead, promising they would celebrate properly next week. Daniel reheated leftovers, watched the minutes bleed past midnight, and sat in silence as the house exhaled around him. When the lock finally clicked, it was 4 a.m. again. Melissa's explanation was thin, her voice soft, her eyes rimmed red. She mumbled about work, but Daniel didn't hear work, he heard distance. That night he picked up his pen and wrote the line that carried more weight than any argument could. Anniversary, 4 a.m. explanation soft, eyes red. For the first time, he didn't feel paranoid. He felt like a witness to his own life, carefully documenting the moment when promises turned into evidence. By the time Daniel filled his second notebook, he realized he could not carry the weight of doubt alone. Witnesses take notes, but litigants collect exhibits. If his marriage was collapsing into a case file, then he would gather every scrap of truth available. Hiring a private investigator felt at first like defeat, a silent confession that love had already failed. To make peace with himself, Daniel dressed it in practical language. It was just outsourcing. He told himself, no different from calling a plumber for a pipe you couldn't see. The firm was called Northline Investigations, a name chosen to sound like a compass. Their retainer arrived as a glossy PDF, full of disclaimers and professional assurances. Daniel wired the deposit, signed electronically, and waited for reality to be delivered in neatly labeled folders. For 3 months, he received updates described as routine sweeps. The emails were clinical, stripped of warmth. The photographs, though technically competent, felt like glimpses of strangers' lives, fragments that could have belonged to anyone. A theater marquee half-lit, a fogged windshield reflecting city lamps, a silhouette crossing a hotel lobby blurred by motion. And then there was the one image that cut him open. Melissa leaving the downtown theater, her fingers intertwined with a man whose cap was pulled low. The timestamp sat just late enough to ruin sleep and just vague enough to be useless in court. It was something, and yet nothing, an image that stung but refused to stand as proof. Daniel read the reports the way people read horoscopes, scanning for a line that explained him. None did. He wanted to believe the world was complicated, not corrupt, that the investigator had been unlucky, that the city had corridors where truth simply slipped past the lens. But the patterns in his own ledger whispered otherwise. On the very nights he had highlighted in yellow, dentist, inventory, working late, Northline's logs marked visual lost. Once, twice, and then again, always at the moments that mattered most. Terrible luck does not repeat with precision. Omission does. It was Mark who spotted it first. He was not a detective, just a man who solved problems by noticing what didn't fit. Laying Daniel's notes beside Northline's report, he tapped the empty columns. They stopped seeing her exactly when you most needed someone to see. You don't have to call it collusion, but it smells like it. Daniel didn't storm into the bedroom with accusations. He turned instead to numbers because numbers still told the truth. While reconciling bank statements, he noticed an entry he had missed before, a legal consultation Melissa had paid for weeks into the investigation. The amount wasn't shocking. The address was. It matched the very same floor and suite number that Northline listed as its administrative partner. It could still have been coincidence, but Daniel had stopped believing in coincidences. He printed the page, highlighted the address, and slid it into a manila folder. Inside that folder were his ledgers, the theater photo, and a quiet export of their shared iCloud album that he had backed up the night it appeared. He labeled the folder not with a name, but with a date, a small superstition against speaking the truth too plainly in a house already wired for arguments. The next morning, he called a different attorney his own. The office smelled faintly of paper and peppermint tea. His lawyer did not perform outrage, did not offer cinematic promises. She asked instead for a chronology. What could he prove? What did he only suspect? Was his son safe? Was he sleeping? When Daniel mentioned the PI's convenient lost visuals, she raised one eyebrow the way movie judges do before delivering a verdict. You don't need them to find something, she said calmly. You need their nothing to look suspicious next to your something. She explained how affidavits could turn notebooks into sworn instruments, how subpoenas could force a garage manager to testify, how ethics, when documented, could become leverage. Daniel left her office with an unexpected assignment: stay calm, keep documenting, and do nothing that could be weaponized against him. If truth was a chessboard, he had moved a pawn and a knight without revealing strategy. The photograph of hands outside the theater was not enough to win, but it was enough to bait the lies into traps of their own making. That night he wrote in his ledger again, the same book that had once made him feel ridiculous for writing anything down at all. 4 a.m. again, not paranoid, observant. He closed the cover and for the first time did not rehearse an argument in his head. Instead, he rehearsed questions for a judge he had not yet met. The PI had found nothing. Good. Daniel would make sure that nothing meant everything when the time came. Daniel changed tactics. The lawyer's words echoed in his head. Calm is preparation. No more midnight interrogations that dissolved into static. No more speeches hurled across a bedroom where both of them stared at opposite walls. Instead, he folded his questions into ordinary sentences, sent them by text, each one small enough to carry, each one clear enough to keep. Melissa pivoted with gymnast precision. "Why are you home late?" he asked. "Because you are controlling," she replied. "Why is your phone always silent?" "Because I need privacy." "Why has intimacy vanished?" "Because you reduce everything to sex." The exchanges read like theater rehearsals where she had memorized her lines. Mark's advice returned to him. The only thing scarier than a liar is a memory forced to carry the lie alone. "Put it in writing," Mark said. "Writing doesn't forget." Daniel obeyed that unromantic wisdom. He let the thread of messages replace the arguments, and in that thread Melissa's tone evolved by the hour. Affectionate at breakfast, neutral by afternoon, combative after 10. Daniel did not mirror the swings. He wrote like a clerk recording rainfall. "Thank you for letting me know. What time should I expect you? I would like to be aligned on plans for our son." He stopped trying to trap her in contradictions. He let the contradictions arrive on their own. On Tuesday, she needed space. On Wednesday, she demanded he stop acting cold. On Thursday, she posted a nostalgic photo of the two of them with a caption about love being work. The comments filled with heart symbols. Daniel wrote nothing. He screenshotted everything. One evening, while adding a dentist appointment to the shared family calendar, Daniel noticed something strange. The calendar had bloomed with color blocks that weren't his, and beside it, in their shared iCloud, a folder he didn't recognize, an anodyne label, the kind people overlook when they are tired. He clicked. The album was a collage of almosts, a coffee cup against a laminate table, the edge of a motel painting, a man's shoulder in a black t-shirt, a mechanic's receipt folded beneath a car key. The photos themselves were coy. The metadata was not. Dates and geotags aligned perfectly with his ledger. Saturday night downtown theater, emergency dental, same block, parking validation, garage 2 streets over. Daniel felt a stillness settle inside him, the kind that comes before a storm you already see on the radar. Melissa walked in while he was staring at the screen. "What are you looking at?" she asked. He answered evenly without accusation. A shared album appeared. She frowned, defensive. "I created it to clear storage. It must have synced by accident. I don't know how those photos got there." Another man might have argued. Daniel had learned the cost of arguing. He nodded once, the way a witness nods in court when facts are already entered. Then he exported the album, saved a duplicate to an external drive, and printed a contact sheet with timestamps. He taped the sheet to the inside of his manila folder and wrote a date in the corner. That night, he texted instead of talking. "For clarity, please confirm, did you create the shared album titled Utilities? For clarity, please confirm, are the photos in that album yours? For clarity, please confirm, did you attend a movie last Saturday?" Her replies came like smoke, curling without form. "Stop micromanaging me. I'm tired of your surveillance. You're making me feel unsafe in my own home." He responded with 10 words at a time. "I am asking for alignment on facts, thank you." When she retreated to the bedroom, he chose the couch. The couch had no history. It smelled of fabric cleaner and sunlight that warmed it in the afternoons. He folded a blanket beneath his head and for the first time in months slept through the night. Morning came with its rituals. He made breakfast, packed his son's lunch, walked him to the bus stop. Ordinary tasks formed a perimeter around extraordinary truths. Gaslighting works best when your calendar is empty. Daniel filled his with proof. At lunch, he forwarded the metadata to his attorney with a simple subject line. "Attached are exports from a shared family album discovered last night. Dates and locations align with my existing notes. Please advise next steps." The reply came measured. "Keep communicating in writing. Do not escalate. If asked, you discovered the album while adding an appointment. Continue collecting." That evening, Melissa performed kindness like a play she had once loved but no longer believed. She asked about his day, brushed his shoulder in passing. Daniel rinsed plates, watched water chase rice grains down the drain. He could respect an effort. He could also respect evidence. Both could be true, but only one would matter later. Before bed, he sent one last text. "For clarity, please confirm your schedule tomorrow." Her reply, "Gym early, office late, home by 9. Daniel wrote the line into his ledger, felt something shift. He no longer feared that he was imagining things. He had photographs, metadata, messages, ledgers, and an album that pretended to be about utilities but delivered only bills. On the couch, he listened to the house breathe. The refrigerator motor, the settling wood, branches scraping the window. Calm is not surrender, he thought. Calm is preparation. And the person who remains calm wins the judge even when there isn't yet a courtroom. He turned onto his side and slept, not because he trusted Melissa, but because he trusted the record he was building. Deadlines are excellent camouflage for private disasters. Daniel's office had just taken on a project so aggressive it devoured weekends, blurred polite boundaries, and kept everyone in survival mode. It was during this chaos that Elena Rivera arrived. A contractor turned full-time, sleeves already rolled, the kind of hire people pretended they had planned all along. She was fast without showing off, precise without being brittle, and unafraid to say good job in a tone that didn't feel like charity. Work, which had become Daniel's only refuge, now turned into something cleaner, a room where his home life could not follow. In the recycled air of the sprint room, they argued over pixels that ordinary people would never notice. At dusk, when the building emptied and the city lights began humming outside, they debriefed over takeout cartons and train timetables. For a while, Elena was not a lifeline. She was a mirror showing Daniel a version of himself that wasn't shrinking. Conversations migrated the way trust often does. From charts to music, from budgets to the catastrophe of Daniel's first apartment with the slanted floor, from tricky clients to Elena's lean years as a freelancer taking any gig that paid on time. One night, she mentioned a regional chain of auto shops she had branded, stickers, signage, a loyalty app no one used. The hairs on Daniel's arm rose. He said the name of the garage written in his ledger out loud. Alina laughed softly. They validate parking with a cloud plate reader. Every entry is logged, otherwise the attendants can't reconcile at the end of the day. He didn't need to ask her for help. She wasn't offering espionage. She was simply explaining how systems worked. Payment confirmations left trails. License plates created timestamps. Memory lived in code even when people tried to bury it. Daniel filed that detail next to his other evidence, the metadata, the theater schedules, the garage receipts. His lattice of proof was growing strong enough to stand on. Respect, Daniel realized, has a sound. It's in the way someone waits for your answer without rushing you. It was a sound that had not lived in his kitchen for a long time. With Alina, it was ordinary. She sent him files on time, asked questions that proved she had read his notes. When he apologized for being distracted, she didn't pry. "You don't owe me the inside of your life," she said, and somehow that made him want to share it. They began walking to the subway together, sometimes missing the first train on purpose. The city at night made room for confessions. Daniel spoke carefully, editing names out of sentences. Alina listened without narrating him back to himself. When she told him about the job that almost broke her, the client who expected 20-hour days and gratitude, Daniel understood her ambition. Sharp, but not cruel. The first time they touched outside of work was not cinematic. Her hand rested on his forearm when he laughed too hard at his own joke. Later, her palm lingered between his shoulders when he admitted he had started sleeping on the couch by choice. The gravity between them felt less like seduction and more like stepping into a warm lobby after months of cold wind. He expected guilt to roar inside him. Instead, what roared was relief. Relief so loud it sounded like silence. Daniel told himself this wasn't revenge, it was survival. Revenge implied Melissa still mattered to the shape of his days. Survival meant he mattered to himself. He might have been lying, but at least it was a lie that allowed him to breathe. Boundaries, his lawyer had warned, were essential, so he kept them. No overnights when his son was home. No blurry photographs that could be twisted on a bad day. No public scenes that could feed the wrong narrative. Alina made it easy by never asking for exceptions. Dignity, once reassembled, was fragile. She seemed to understand that. One night, while they sat beneath the orange glow of heat lamps, Alina circled back to their earlier talk. "If you ever needed to dispute a charge at that garage," she said casually, "their manager will send a CSV of plate entries for your dates. It's boring, but it's searchable. I had to audit one once when their app double-validated after midnight." Daniel nodded, storing the knowledge away. Systems. The word fit perfectly into the quiet architecture of his life. He didn't need a confrontation to win. He needed math. When they finally crossed the line from confidants to lovers, it wasn't with fireworks. It happened like a door closing softly in a storm so the house wouldn't lose heat. Daniel memorized the honesty of it. No lies told with hands, no words twisted into weapons, no fantasies about rescue. Afterward, he sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for shame. It didn't come. What came instead was clarity, quiet and restorative, like a full night's sleep. Alina traced the crease in his palm with one finger, as if reading a map. "Whatever this is," she whispered, "it doesn't have to be another secret that hurts you." "It can't be," he said. "I won't let it." When he walked home in the cool night air, pockets empty, head quiet, the manila folder waited on his kitchen counter like a metronome. He opened his ledger and wrote a line before bed. "Garage validation uses cloud log, searchable by date and plate. Do not rush." The house breathed around him, the refrigerator's motor, the heater's hum. His son turning over in his sleep. Relief was not forgiveness. Relief was oxygen. And for the first time in months, Daniel let himself breathe it. Holidays have a way of magnifying everything. Joy, hunger, loneliness. That Christmas, the Carter house buzzed with the respectable noise of tradition. Wrapping paper drifted across the floor like seaweed. Batteries were hunted down from junk drawers. A turkey came out a shade too dry but was still carved as if it were love. Their son built a fort out of boxes and declared it a castle, his laughter echoing through rooms that had grown cold in other ways. Melissa moved through it all with a smile crafted for photographs. Daniel moved through it too, laying plates, handing out screwdrivers, nodding to relatives on video calls. From the outside, they looked intact. Inside, gravity was pulling everything down, quietly but decisively. When the house finally quieted, castle collapsed, dishwasher humming, lights dimmed, Melissa stood in the doorway to the living room. Tears broke without warning. This was not the performance sob of someone demanding attention. This was the sound of a dam that had bargained too long with itself. Daniel stayed seated on the edge of the couch, palms flat on his knees, bracing for impact. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice cracked. "A long one." He didn't respond immediately. The silence between them felt like an elevator stuck between floors, air too close, panel lights refusing to change. Finally, his voice came out measured, bureaucratic. "How long?" "A year," she whispered. "More than a year. I ended it." Daniel's chest tightened, but his face held steady. "With who?" "A mechanic," she admitted, flinching as if the word itself carried grease. "It was stupid. I felt old, like motherhood had shrunk me, like marriage had turned me into a hallway for other people to walk through." He let the words land. He refused to catch them. "Dates," he said flatly. "I need dates." Melissa started listing them. In Daniel's head, the calendar turned red. Recital night delayed by traffic. The road trip canceled for inventory. The Thursday she begged him to pick up their son for an emergency dental appointment. Every excuse matched an entry already written in his ledger. He pressed once more. "On his birthday, we booked the trampoline place. You were late." "The office," she said quickly, too quickly. "Where?" "The office," she repeated, but her eyes shifted to the middle distance, where truth hovers before it breaks. Finally, she admitted, "An apartment off the highway, easy to park." "What exit?" She named it. It matched the logbooks, the garage charges, the theater schedules, the metadata of photographs taken in rooms that pretended to be anywhere and ended up being nowhere. "I ended it," she said again, as if repetition could paint over rot. "He didn't mean anything. You mean everything." Daniel looked at the Christmas tree. A strand of lights had gone out at the bottom, unnoticed because the top still glowed. He rose, walked to the window, and watched his own reflection stand beside him. His voice carried no rage, only conclusion. "Thank you for telling me the marriage is over." The words sounded external, like an announcement played over a station loudspeaker. Melissa startled, arms lifted in choreography from an earlier chapter, eyes pleading for a reset that would never come. He stepped aside, not unkindly. Gentleness, he discovered, was sometimes the sharpest instrument. "Daniel, please," she begged. "We can fix it, set rules, therapy, I'll do anything." "For our son," he said evenly, "we may do therapy, we will set rules, but the marriage is over." He didn't mention the iCloud album, the attorney, the manila folder labeled with dates instead of names. Evidence doesn't need to sing every verse, it only needs to stand. Melissa's desperation spilled. "I was lonely, you were always working, I felt invisible." "I was working to keep us," Daniel answered, "and I became invisible doing it." Silence spread across the room like fog across a field, slow at first, then complete. Melissa curled into the chair opposite him, arms around her knees, hair hiding her face. "Does he know?" she asked quietly. "About us, about you ending it." Daniel didn't bother to clarify who he was. Names were Dacre. Structure didn't need them. "He knows enough," Daniel said. "And if he doesn't, he will when he stops needing you." Her voice cracked like a hinge. "You're cruel." "I'm finished," Daniel replied. "There's a difference." He moved through the house without slamming doors, gathering stray gift wrap into a bag, stacking collapsed boxes by the door, ordinary cleanup serving as liturgy. He switched off the tree, and the room darkened into its honest shape. In the kitchen, he reached for his notebook, the one now kept beside flour and takeout menus because facts belonged among staples. His pen pressed steady. Christmas night, confession, apartment off highway named, marriage declared over. Back in the living room, Melissa remained small, knees pulled tight, as if the rug might open and swallow her. Daniel walked past without anger, carrying only the verdict that needed no more arguments. That night, instead of grief stalking him in the dark, sleep arrived clean, like a verdict that had already been signed. The morning after Christmas, Daniel woke not with grief but with purpose. Melissa's confession had closed a door. Now he needed to lock the rest of the house behind it. If the marriage was over, then survival required structure. He treated the next week like a disaster drill. Before coffee, he was already on the phone with banks. New checking accounts, new savings accounts, new card numbers that did not autofill anywhere Melissa could reach. Old lines of credit were frozen. What had once symbolized partnership now represented exposure. He downloaded everything the cloud would surrender: photos, calendars, device backups, and copied them onto an external drive labeled with the plainest word he could think of: records. Passwords changed. Two-factor authentication blinked to life like motion sensors in a dark yard. Daniel did not perform rage, he performed logistics. Every move was quiet, deliberate, documented. The joint account split into parallel rails, each transfer between them carefully recorded. Subscriptions and bills were mapped like a circuit diagram. Where his name wasn't essential, he removed it. Where a toggle didn't exist, he picked up the phone. His voice was calm, the tone that unlocked doors. Please confirm the change and send the confirmation number by email. Paper followed his words. Paper never forgets. When he walked back into his lawyer's office, he was no longer a husband gasping for truth. He was a client with evidence. He laid his ledger on the table, the iCloud exports, the single theater photo, the list of nights marked at 4 in the morning. His lawyer didn't congratulate him. She didn't console him. She arranged his documents like a city grid and asked for a chronology. When he told her about the apartment off the highway, she nodded, not in surprise, but in recognition. Patterns matter. Courts understand patterns. In this jurisdiction, she explained, proof shapes outcomes, not rumors, not righteous anger, proof. She wanted corroboration from places that could not lie: the apartment's logbook for package pickups, the garage plate reader hits for Melissa's car, metadata from the shared calendar tying Melissa's claims to places she wasn't. Then she leaned forward, her voice firm but fair. If you continue a relationship with MS. Rivera, keep it clean. No overnights when your son is home. No photographs that can be spun against you. No messages that could turn tenderness into ammunition. Boundaries are not morality theater. They are scaffolding. They hold your case in high wind. Daniel recognized the discipline. It was the same muscle he had flexed for years, anticipating what could go wrong, designing so it didn't. Leaving her office, winter air rinsed his lungs. He didn't feel like a man who had won anything. He felt like someone who had finally stopped bleeding. On the walk back to his car, he drafted an email exactly as she had instructed. To the apartment building, a courteous request for elevator access records tied to a specific key fob. A narrower request for package logs under Melissa's name. He CC'd himself from a new email address, one Melissa's devices had never seen. The next email went to the garage manager, framed innocently as a dispute over a parking validation. Please provide a CSV of all entries for this plate number, these dates. Boring requests, perfectly polite. Boring was perfect. At home, Daniel cooked dinner, helped his son with spelling homework, tucked him in without commentary. Only after bedtime did he sit at the table, arranging his life into piles: financial, custody, communications, evidence. Melissa appeared in the doorway, asking if they could talk. About expectations, she said, as if the word itself could rewind time. Daniel didn't look up from his papers. Expectations are for co-parents, he answered. We'll write them down. Later, he texted Alina with one simple message: I need to slow everything down around my son. She replied the way she always did, with respect. No questions he couldn't answer. No pressure disguised as care. Under the lawyer's rules, what lived between them could continue, but it had to survive in daylight. When the garage manager's spreadsheet arrived, it looked like static. Daniel filtered the rows by license plate. The times aligned with his ledger like teeth in a zipper. He didn't forward it to Melissa. He didn't throw it in her face. He filed it in records, Then he forwarded it to his lawyer, who would know how to make numbers speak. By Friday, the week had acquired sharp edges, money compartmentalized, data duplicated, requests in motion, boundaries drawn. Daniel understood something painful and clear. He had stopped being a husband. He had become a litigant. Nobody teaches you how to grieve that shift. In the mirror, he saw a man carrying two truths at once. Love had once been real, and paperwork was now the only language that protected what remained of it. Before bed, he opened his ledger and wrote, "System in place, proof over noise, proceed without spectacle." He turned off the light in a house that still looked from the street like a family home. Inside, it was a fortress of documents and discipline. And for the second time that month, Daniel slept without the past shaking him awake. The paper trail no longer pointed vaguely. It circled tighter with every loop. A name surfaced first on a small receipt, Rico Salazar. It was scribbled at the bottom of a repair ticket Melissa had paid with their joint card months earlier. A brake pad discount, a handwritten THXM. Casual, familiar, the kind of note exchanged between regulars or between something more. Daniel didn't jump to conclusions, but he could feel the knot tightening. At the apartment off the highway, the lobby attendant remembered Melissa before Daniel finished describing her. "Pretty, quiet, always in a hurry," she said, flipping through a ring binder of package logs. Melissa's signature appeared 3 times beside Unit 4B. The unit was leased, the attendant explained, by a relative arrangement. The intercom listed Salazar. The uncle held the lease. The nephew, Rico, had the key card. Proximity wrote the rest of the story. Elena helped Daniel draft the records requests his lawyer had advised. They didn't pretend to be detectives. They were customers with questions, always polite, always specific. The garage manager, tired in tone but generous in detail, forwarded a spreadsheet from the plate reader system. Each timestamp sat neatly in its cell, entry, exit, validation source. When Daniel filtered for Melissa's license plate, the rows clicked into a bracelet that matched his ledger, Fridays, a handful of Tuesdays, the 4 a.m. anniversary. Elena leaned over the laptop, eyes narrowing. "Coincidence has a schedule now," she murmured. Respect kept her from smiling, but the truth weighed heavy between them. Later, Daniel walked the block with Mark, laying geography over suspicion. The theater marquee blinking across the street. The garage pedestrian exit spilling onto a side lane. The apartment lobby just 30 paces down. Glass door fogged by winter breath. A security camera staring blankly from chest height. "You could lie for 2 hours and never leave this square," Mark observed. "Call it inventory, call it a dentist appointment, and nobody would contradict you." Daniel nodded silently. He no longer needed metaphors. He had coordinates. He took photos of corners and sidewalks, not because a judge cared, street views didn't belong in court, but because he wanted the memory to stop being a story and become a map. Stories argued. Layouts measured. Melissa, for her part, shifted her performance. Her tone softened like a radio tune just shy of clear. She said she had ended it. She said she wanted to try again. She said Daniel could set the terms, curfews, passwords, anything, if it meant she could stay. She seemed ready to live in a house built on rules if it earned her a bed. "We can reset," she whispered in the kitchen, as if whispering made it truer. Daniel let the silence answer. He no longer negotiated with a past that had already spent itself. When she reached for his arm, he stepped aside, not harsh, simply making space as though in a crowded train. Gentleness again, not for her, for himself, for the paperwork that needed no contamination of rage. The garage manager followed up with a call to clarify a field code. Daniel thanked him the way one thanks a nurse drawing blood, grateful, resigned, steady. The CSV showed validations tied to a business account under Salazar Automotive, the same name on the brake pad ticket. A few entries marked tenant override. Elena tilted her head, reading between the lines. "Key card at the turnstile," she guessed. "Staff can buzz you out if you live next door." The apartment's maintenance office, after a few polite exchanges, confirmed that tenants in 4B had requested repeated elevator resets due to access errors. On the very nights Melissa had claimed late office inventory. Systems, Daniel thought, notice what people try to hide. Melissa tried again, this time with tears and catalogs of self-reproach. I ended it for real. Please tell me what to do. Daniel kept his voice low. Follow the agreement. He was done being the only adult in the room. Later that week, Mark met him outside the theater. They stood under a poster for a new release, the glass reflecting a giant face pretending to look surprised. No more watching, Daniel said quietly. Mark gripped his shoulder. Being right doesn't warm a bed, but it heats a courtroom. Walking back to his car, Daniel traced in his mind the path Melissa must have taken 100 times. Ticket pulled, car parked, steps counted to the side door, the short glide to 4B's elevator, the lie typed into her phone, delivered like tap water. It wasn't cinematic. It was routine. That was the deepest injury of all, not just betrayal, but the sheer administrative efficiency of it. That night, Melissa's final message appeared on his phone. I ended it for real. Please, tell me what to do. Daniel stared at the blue bubble until it dimmed. Then he typed 3 words that fit the man he had become. Follow the agreement. He didn't need to shout. He had paper, and paper traveled farther than please. Mark never trusted neat reports. Real life smeared. Only fiction came back laminated. The Northline packet Daniel had received was too clean in the places where life was always messy. Mark couldn't let it go. If they are incompetent, why are they incompetent on schedule? He asked one night, spreading Daniel's ledger beside Northline's report on the kitchen island. And if they are unlucky, why are they unlucky exactly when you needed them to be lucky? The pattern was too sharp, the blanks too perfectly aligned. Mark started dialing numbers buried in the fine print. Reception, admin partner, a generic inbox hidden in the footer. He was polite, the way people are when they want doors to stay open. On the third try, a clerk answered, voice bright with the nervous eagerness of someone new to the job. Mark, feigning the confusion of an overcharged client, asked about a referral admin fee line on the invoice. Does that belong to you? He said gently. Or to the law office in Suite 402? The pause on the other end told him everything. A minute later, an email landed in Daniel's inbox, misfiled by accident, forwarded without thinking. The subject line read, Referral Admin, Northline Hadley & Co. Inside was a chain that read like people who had forgotten someone else might be watching. It spoke of introductions to facilitate efficiencies for overlapping domestic matters. It mentioned a percentage to be remitted monthly, and it contained a phrase about client expectations management that landed like a wink printed in black ink. It wasn't a smoking gun. It didn't need to be. The optics alone were poisonous. If not illegal, it was an ethical tangle that no judge would want to touch. Daniel forwarded it immediately to his lawyer. She called back before the ringtone ended. Do not reply, she instructed. Preserve headers, save the thread in 2 places. This isn't about proving collusion, it's about discouraging their enthusiasm. Her tone warmed by half a degree. This might keep a war from starting. At almost the same time, as though the universe enjoyed cruel timing, Daniel received an anonymous email from a burner address. No greeting, no commentary, just a link. Inside was a folder filled with photographs, images that had never appeared in Northline's glossy PDF. Melissa stepping out of the highway-adjacent lobby. In a windbreaker 1 week, a sundress the next, a raincoat another, always with the same man in the same cap pulled low. The timestamps were merciless, weeks apart, months apart, consistent. There was the corner of a theater poster. The garage gate arm caught mid-rise, the glow of a lobby camera at chest height. The photos weren't lurid, they were worse, they were ordinary, and that ordinariness made them incontrovertible. Daniel's stomach turned once, disciplined, then steadied. He saved the files without renaming them, exported the metadata, printed contact sheets. He wrote down hash values the paralegal had taught him to generate. Chain of custody was no longer a phrase he said with irony. He placed the evidence into his records folder and did not look again. The point was not to feel, the point was to prove. Where did these come from? Mark asked. Either a conscience or a turf war, Daniel said. Does it matter? It matters enough to be careful, Mark replied, but not enough to stop. When Daniel's lawyer saw the photographs, she smiled, not with joy, but with the precise satisfaction of a surgeon discovering a tumor had edges. We won't lead with these, she said. We'll let them exist. If needed, we authenticate, or we call the sender unknown witness number 1 and watch opposing counsel decide how badly they want to ask questions. Timing, Daniel had learned, was everything. Reveal truth too early and it becomes debate. Reveal it at the right moment, and it closes doors like a verdict. So he didn't storm upstairs with blown-up prints. He didn't bait Melissa into confessions. He didn't even mention Rico's name. Instead, he cooked dinner, helped with math homework, Googled how to remove permanent marker from a wooden table. In the quiet after bedtime, he organized the week ahead like a general who already knew which hill mattered most. The next morning, Northline left a voicemail, cheerful as ever, offering a complimentary extension of surveillance to restore confidence. Daniel saved the audio and forwarded it to his lawyer without reply. An hour later, Suite 402 emailed Melissa directly, options that protect both parties. She forwarded it to Daniel as if to prove transparency. He thanked her politely and filed the email in records. Mark drafted a licensing board complaint, factual and restrained, no accusations, only a description of coincidences too sharp to ignore. We may never send it, Daniel said, reading over his shoulder. But it's a leash if they snap. That Friday, Daniel's son asked if they could see the new superhero movie. The theater's name hit the air like a dare. Daniel smiled. Next weekend, this one we do pancakes. He didn't owe the marquee anything. He owed his son a Saturday that didn't smell like testimony. That night, Melissa lingered in the doorway to the kitchen, posture hesitant, words waiting for permission. I know I broke it, she whispered. Tell me how to fix it. Daniel wiped the counter, set the towel down with precision. You can't, he said softly, but you can stop making it worse. Later, he opened his ledger, the same book that had once felt like paranoia and now felt like a spine, and wrote 2 new lines. Referral agreements surfaced between Northline and Suite 402, preserved. Anonymous photos confirm apartment and theater exits across weeks. Timestamps a line, hold. Then he closed the cover and slept like a man holding a key he wasn't yet ready to turn. Corporate parties were designed to be proof of harmony. Polished shoes, small talk rehearsed on the commute, photographs that lived on internal newsletters and nowhere else. That winter, Daniel stood in the banquet hall beneath chandeliers that glowed like expensive lies. Melissa had insisted they attend together. Optics, she'd said, dressing the word like a lifeline. She wore a black dress chosen for contrast, smile calibrated to hint at recovery. To anyone else, they looked like a couple on the mend, brave enough to face the public. To Daniel, the evening felt like theater staged on quicksand. The banquet opened with applause for quarterly numbers, a slideshow of client logos. Melissa laughed on cue, fingers brushing his wrist as if muscle memory might persuade him back into orbit. Daniel let the gesture hang unanswered. Across the room, Alina stood near the design team, her hair pinned up, her voice carrying only enough to join the group without claiming attention. She hadn't asked if he wanted her there. She didn't need to. They both knew the rules. No proximity beyond plausible deniability. No careless photographs. Respect could live in silence. But silence cracked when Melissa drank too fast. By the second glass, her voice carried an octave too high. By the third, she circled colleagues like a satellite losing orbit. A joke that should have landed with charm came out with teeth. A toast meant to honor the project leads turned into an aside about Daniel's, long hours and longer silences. The room stiffened. Smiles pinned themselves in place, but the air tilted. Daniel's instinct was not to rescue. He had stopped curating her image months ago. He folded his hands, letting her words fall where they may. Alina caught his eye from across the room, a look that wasn't pity but recognition. This is what fracture sounds like when performed on a stage too bright. She turned back to her circle, careful, disciplined. Melissa, meanwhile, kept unraveling. At dessert, she leaned too close to a junior analyst, laughing at a volume that cut through the music. When someone asked about her holiday, she blurted, "Oh, Daniel gave me the gift of paperwork." The table went still. She giggled like it was a joke, but her eyes flickered at Daniel, testing for rescue. He gave her none. Later, on the dance floor, under the safe noise of bass and chatter, Melissa cornered him. Her breath smelled of gin, her words slurred into confession. "I ended it. You know that, right? He doesn't mean anything. I'm here, aren't I?" Daniel leaned closer only so she would not have to shout. "You're here because I haven't filed yet." She recoiled, the word slapping harder than any public refusal. At that moment, Rico's name slid through the crowd like static. Someone from operations mentioned Salazar Automotive sponsoring a trade event. Another muttered about discounts, loyalty programs, a garage near the highway. The coincidence was small, unintentional, but Melissa heard it, and her glass shattered in her hand before she even realized she had gripped too tight. Blood welled along her palm, bright under the chandelier. Gasps followed, napkins rushed, someone fetched ice. Melissa laughed too loudly through the sting. "I'm fine," she insisted. "Just clumsy." Daniel watched colleagues absorb the scene, the polished couple not quite polished, the laughter edged, the glass breaking at the mention of a name no one else cared about. Public fractures leave private echoes. He knew those echoes would travel back through cubicles, Slack channels, carpool chatter. The evening ended with photographs anyway, groups smiling under company banners. Daniel posed with his team, Melissa standing stiffly at his side. The shutter clicked, capturing two people bound by frame but not by future. At home, silence returned like gravity. Melissa retreated to the bathroom, bandaging her hand with shaky precision. Daniel sat at the dining table, his ledger open, writing. Company party, public unravel, glass incident, name surfaced, Salazar, witnesses present. The entry wasn't vindictive, it was archival. When Melissa emerged, hand wrapped, eyes rimmed red, she whispered, "You let me drown out there." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "You were already underwater. I just stopped pretending we could both breathe." She turned away, shoulders shaking, retreating not to bed but to the couch, a switch Daniel had made months earlier. Now it was her exile. Alone in the quiet, Daniel closed the ledger. The house was split in more than bedrooms now. It was split in sight lines, in truths, in who collapsed and who recorded. And this time it wasn't hidden. The world had seen the first crack. The fractures from the company party didn't stay contained. By Monday, whispers traveled faster than memos. A glass breaking, a name overheard, a joke that landed like a bruise. Those things never die quietly in corporate corridors. Melissa must have sensed the ground slipping because by Tuesday she launched her counterattack. She cornered Daniel in the kitchen, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You've been distant for months. Do you think people don't notice? I should be asking you what you're hiding." Daniel looked at her steady. He had expected this. The guilty often find refuge in projection. Her voice climbed. "I saw the way you looked at her at Alina. Don't you dare stand there pretending you're innocent. Emotional affairs count too, Daniel. He didn't rise to the bait. If you're accusing me, put it in writing." That stopped her for a beat. She wanted chaos, not documentation. "You're cruel," she said instead, voice trembling. "I confess to you I beg to work on us, and you file notes like a machine." Daniel opened his ledger deliberately, pen poised. "This conversation is part of the record. Date, time, accusation made against me without evidence." Melissa's face drained. For the first time she saw it. The wall of paper, the calm precision, the refusal to be dragged into mud. Her chaos couldn't stain a page already written in clean lines. The next move came not in their kitchen, but through her lawyer. A formal letter arrived alleging Daniel had engaged in inappropriate familiarity with a colleague. The phrasing was careful, designed to sting but not stick. It carried no proof, only the hope of leverage. Daniel's attorney barely blinked. She stacked the letter beside the folder labeled records and slid across the photographs, the timestamps, the garage logs. "We respond by asking for reciprocal disclosures," she explained. "They wanted noise, we'll give them silence padded with facts." Within a week, Melissa's accusation backfired. Her own attorney, faced with the weight of receipts and the absence of ammunition, advised her to tread carefully. Judges don't like mudslinging without mud, Daniel overheard once, whispered through a wall too thin. Meanwhile, at work, Melissa's narrative failed to take root. Colleagues remembered the party too vividly, the broken glass, the pointed jokes, the nervous laughter. Accusations felt like theater staged too late. Instead of sympathy, she earned distance. Daniel never gloated. He didn't need to. Watching her attempts collapse under their own weight was victory enough. One evening, she tried again, her voice small this time, almost pleading. "If you cared about me at all, you'd fight for us the way you fight for your case." Daniel looked at her exhausted but clear. "I am fighting for our son, for a life built on truth. You're confusing that with saving you." Her tears came sharp and immediate, but tears, like accusations, had lost their currency. That night, Daniel wrote one more line in his ledger. Accusations launched. No proof. Backfired. He closed the book knowing that the war she tried to start had already burned her own side first. The backlash didn't announce itself with fireworks. It came in whispers, in meetings that ended quicker than they began, in invitations that stopped arriving. The party had been the crack. Melissa's accusations were the hammer that split the fault line. By mid-January, colleagues who once smiled reflexively at her now smiled with calculation, as if weighing the cost. The break room went quiet when she entered. Conversations shifted just enough to tell her she was no longer trusted with their full sentences. Daniel didn't need to orchestrate it. The truth had momentum of its own. Her manager called one Friday afternoon, his tone polite but clipped. "There have been concerns about professionalism at recent events. We'd like you to take some personal time, reset, recharge." The words were polished, the meaning blunt. Step aside before you become liability. Melissa came home that evening brittle with fury. She slammed her bag on the counter, turned on Daniel like a storm in a small room. "This is your fault. You sit there with your damn notes while my life falls apart." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "I didn't hand you the glass at that party. I didn't make you accuse without proof. Actions return to their owner." The phrase landed harder than any shout. For the first time, Melissa's expression faltered, not anger, not tears, but the hollow realization of consequence. Days later, karma sharpened again. Rico, the mechanic with the key card, stopped answering her calls. His number rang into silence, his garage visits marked out sick, though the shop lights glowed late into the night. The affair that once felt like escape now resembled abandonment. Melissa tried to disguise the panic, but Daniel noticed. The restless pacing, the sudden late-night showers, the way she checked her phone with hunger instead of habit. Her anchor was gone, and she was left in freefall. At work, the HR department requested a meeting. "Anonymous complaints," they said carefully, "about conduct at company events." Melissa's voice cracked trying to deny it, but denials don't erase patterns already whispered in hallways. When she returned home, she found Daniel at the dining table with his ledger open, reviewing bank statements and custody guidelines. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply looked at her and said, "This is only the first return. It doesn't end here." That night, Melissa slept on the couch again, tossing between anger and despair. Daniel, in the bedroom, slept with the calm of a man who had stopped fighting storms and started building shelters. For months, she had thought she was untouchable. Now, karma had found her address, and it was only just knocking. It wasn't the lawyers or the ledgers that shifted the balance next. It was a sentence spoken without calculation, from the only person who had never picked a side. One Wednesday evening, Daniel picked up his son from school. The boy climbed into the back seat, backpack sliding off his shoulders, voice casual in the way children reveal truths adults bury. "Mom's friend was at our house again last night," he said, pulling out a juice box. "The one with the baseball cap. He fixed the squeaky door in the garage." Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter but kept his voice even. "How do you know he fixed it?" The boy shrugged. "Because I asked him." He laughed and said, "Your mom owes me a favor now." Then he winked. The words hit harder than any affidavit. Daniel didn't press. Children don't embellish with strategy. They report the world as it appeared to them. At dinner, his son mentioned it again, this time in front of Melissa. "Mom, when's your friend coming back? The garage door works now." Melissa froze, fork midair. The silence stretched brittle. Daniel didn't rescue her. He chewed, swallowed, set his glass down with quiet finality. Her face flushed, then hardened. "He's just a mechanic," she snapped, too sharp, too defensive. The boy looked between them, puzzled, sensing the weight without understanding its shape. After bedtime, Melissa stormed into the living room. "You're filling his head with this. You're making him suspicious." Daniel didn't look up from his ledger. "I didn't give him words, he gave them to both of us." For the first time, Melissa's fury cracked into fear. She knew lawyers could be fought, colleagues discredited, even photographs questioned. But the testimony of a child, innocent, uncoached, unprompted, was the kind of truth judges leaned toward without hesitation. Daniel noted the moment quietly in his records. Child reports presence of third party in home. Identified by description consistent with RICO. Statement voluntary, repeated. He didn't need a witness stand. He didn't need cross-examination. What mattered was that his son had seen and remembered, and that memory would outlive every excuse Melissa rehearsed. The next morning, when Melissa tried to pour cereal, the boy said it again, unbothered, unburdened. "Mom, tell your friend thanks for fixing the garage." She dropped the spoon. Milk splashed across the counter, dripping like a verdict. Daniel wiped it silently, each motion deliberate, as though sealing the testimony in ink. Melissa's eyes glistened with panic, but no words came. For the first time, she understood. The walls of her deception weren't closing in because of Daniel's notes. They were closing in because even her child had started to hold the mirror. And no courtroom in the world could dismiss that kind of truth. The moment didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with ink. Daniel sat at the dining table on a quiet Sunday morning. The house was still. Melissa had taken the couch again, his son asleep in his room. The ledger lay open, pages filled with months of dates, receipts, photographs, and sentences spoken by accident. It looked less like paranoia now, more like scripture, an account no one could erase. He took out a separate sheet of paper, crisp, legal, the petition his lawyer had prepared. The words were clinical: dissolution of marriage, irreconcilable differences, primary custody petitioned by petitioner. But beneath the sterile ink lived everything: the 4 a.m. absences, the garage receipts, the glass breaking under chandeliers, the child's testimony about a man with a cap. Every fracture was written here, translated into paragraphs that could stand in court. Melissa entered the kitchen as he reviewed the document. Her hand was still bandaged, eyes swollen from a night without sleep. She looked at the papers, then at him. "You're really doing this?" Daniel didn't raise his voice. "I'm not doing this. You already did." She tried for tenderness, a last performance. "We can fix it. I'll cut him off. I'll prove." He slid the papers toward her, a pen resting neatly on top. "What you broke doesn't need fixing. It needs ending." The words stunned her more than anger ever had. For months she had braced for shouting, for slammed doors, for spectacle. Instead, he gave her silence bound in ink. Her tears came hot, spilling onto the margin of the page. She didn't sign, not yet, but Daniel wasn't waiting for permission anymore. His lawyer would file with or without her cooperation. That afternoon, he added the final entry to his ledger. Clean break initiated. Petition filed, record complete. He closed the book and slid it into a drawer, not hidden but put away like a chapter that had been lived long enough. The house felt different that evening. Not lighter, not yet, but steady like a bridge that had finally stopped swaying. Melissa lingered in the doorway, eyes red, voice barely audible. "You're not even angry anymore." Daniel shook his head. "Anger keeps you tethered. I'm free." For the first time in a year, he meant it. The war had been fought on paper, and paper had won. Revenge in movies looked like fire, explosions, wreckage, a final scream across a battlefield. In real life, Daniel discovered, revenge looked quieter. It looked like mornings reclaimed. The decree arrived in a plain envelope, thin but weighty. Daniel read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer where the ledger now lived. The house no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like a home with space to grow back into itself. Saturday mornings became pancakes again, flour on his son's cheek as they argued over who flipped better. Sunday afternoons belonged to library trips, returning books late with a smile, fines paid without regret. On weekdays, bedtime stories ended without glancing at the clock. The rhythms of life returned, not rushed, not negotiated, simply lived. Melissa lingered in the background of his life, but no longer at its center. She called sometimes, her voice brittle with nostalgia as if trying to name what they used to be. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't even remind her of the record. He understood something she didn't yet. Closure doesn't require agreement. Alina appeared slowly, naturally. No secrets, no overlap. They weren't running from anything. They were walking towards something. Their conversations carried dents and laughter in equal measure. Daniel didn't rush. He had learned that rebuilding required patience, not performance. One evening over coffee, Alina said softly, "You don't talk about revenge much." Daniel smiled, stirring sugar into his cup. "Because this is it. Revenge isn't burning her life down, it's building one she can't reach." Melissa, for her part, wrote a letter weeks later. Apologies tangled with rationalizations, lines about being bored and needing excitement. Daniel didn't tear it up. He didn't treasure it either. He placed it in a box with other documents, evidence of a past chapter, not an active wound. The final entry in his ledger wasn't about Melissa at all. It read, "Life resumed, choices reclaimed, story no longer hers." Daniel closed the book and didn't open it again. He understood now that aftermath wasn't the epilogue, it was the point. Not an afterthought, but a deliberate life lived beyond betrayal. And in that quiet, steady revenge, he found something better than justice. He found peace, and that is where this story ends. A year of lies exposed, a marriage destroyed, and a man who chose truth and dignity over silence. Betrayal always carries a price. Sometimes it's losing trust, sometimes it's losing everything. What would you have done if you were in Daniel's shoes? Would you confront, forgive, or seek revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us here at Cheating Stories 7 for more powerful dramas of love, betrayal, and consequences. Until next time, stay strong. And remember, lies may last for a while, but the truth always comes through.